Hey, it's Bear Gardner, and I am back with another one of my game theory videos and general strategy, I suppose. It's going to get wide in the way that I approach it. This time, we are going to approach a particular quote again, or at least concept again, and I'm going to come at it from the point of view of distilling it down, explaining it a bit, and then attempting to relate it specifically to cards. We will, first of all, need to see what it is we're going to talk about. So this is from a very famous piece of effectively military and tactical literature. So Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War. We are moderately certain. There have been debates, but current logic holds that Sun Tzu was probably a real person. The Art of War did get written, although it can also translate as The Art of Strategy. You probably don't need me to go into that level of nerdiness. Somewhere around 300 BCE, or BC if you prefer the old school version of it, which is to say an incredibly long time ago. Translations vary because we are talking about translation from Chinese, so those of you who are better at that than I am, bear with it. I'm working off different forms and versions. I've read probably a dozen translations of Sun Tzu over the years, and it varies. This particular one stands out to me, and always has done, for its impact on game theory. So, as usual, let's start by going through the concept, the quote. The general who wins a battle makes many calculations in his temple before the battle is fought. The general who loses a battle makes but a few calculations beforehand. Thus do many calculations lead to victory, and few calculations to defeat. How much more so no calculations at all? It is by attention to this point that I can foresee who is likely to win or lose. Unpacking time. First of all, let's deal with some of the language issues. Temple is a very specific translation, may not be perfectly accurate. Basically, base, headquarters, camp, however you want to look at it. The place where you prepare, the war room, if you will. Now, the things we need to do to apply this to cards. First of all, we need to define a battle or a conflict. Now, in cards, this is more complicated than you might think. I personally tend not to approach cards with the idea that one game is a single conflict. I find that is at times problematic. I prefer to view a game as a war rather than a battle, as it were, an extended conflict in which strategy, which is the upper level of consideration, applies at the beginning and then tactics applies through. Sun Tzu's concept here, the idea of calculation, particularly in a game where we are taking turns rather than instantaneously reacting, even with a time limit, can apply equally to the smaller part of the conflict as well as the greater conflict. Yes, there is value in calculations in our deck building and planning and mulligans, and I've done a video on mulligans, and this is a concept that is part of that. But in this particular case, I want to talk about its relevance in specific circumstances in cards. So, next we define calculation. Now, calculation does not just mean mathematics. It does, a chunk of the time, mean mathematics. I personally believe that a decent grasp of mathematics is incredibly helpful in cards. But it is also a calculation of position, of consideration, of your opponent's likely position or likely direction of travel. These are all calculations. What Sun Tzu is getting across here, the understanding that is the greater thought we devote to understanding and being aware of something, the less prone we are to making mistakes. Leastways, that's the business translation. Sun Tzu has been translated and used in actual warfare, obviously, but also, bizarrely, in social conflict. There are loads of business manuals that were very popular in the 80s and 90s, particularly the early 90s. There were many high-end businesses that made a huge push towards the idea that the art of strategy was integral to business. The concepts that are explained can be broken down into so many different circumstances, which is one of the reasons that those of us who like game theory will go back to these as concepts to build from. Abstract strategy, game theory, that sort of thing can all feed off of Sun Tzu in a way that you can't off some other particular points of view. So, the next question is, how can we go about using this in cards? So, I could talk endlessly about the actual meaning of these, and we will briefly cover them. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose a challenge for you. So, you'll either enjoy it or you won't. See how we go. But we'll get there in a second. So let's begin by understanding how I approach this personally in an individual situation in cards. As soon as my concentration comes down, my opponent's turn is over, everything becomes static. A concept that is worth considering here is something called ipon me, which means mind like water. Those of us who study martial arts and conflict are taught this concept. The idea is that your mind in conflict should be like a still pond. And the events that take place, the circumstances and changes are like rocks thrown into the pond. They land, they create ripples, often many ripples, bigger ones, smaller ones. But with a breath and a moment, the ripple settles and you return to a state of calm. And then from that place of calm, we can calculate effectively a course of action. From a place of agitation or confusion, we are likely to make mistakes. So, at the beginning of the moment of staticness, as it were, the first thing I'm doing is just taking in what's in front of me. The next thing I'm doing is beginning my calculations. Those calculations will involve my opponent's HQ, my HQ, my opponent's credit count, my credit count, cards I have in hand, how many cards my opponent has in hand, and any cards that I may or may not know are there, and of course the cards and effects that are on the board. These calculations then lead me to think about lines. Thinking in lines is incredibly important. This is considering what we can do and playing it through in our head, using mathematics and understanding to understand what that might be. Right. So at this point, I'm reaching the edge of being able to explain this effectively verbally when there is a much more productive, in my experience, way of doing this. So what is going to happen is, when I am done explaining this, I'm going to lay a challenge. As I said, the challenge is this. I'm going to put a board state on the screen. You are playing, from your perspective, a hand and a situation from a hypothetical game. This is actually drawn from a game that I played through and modified to make it into a better teaching exercise. I'm going to leave it there for 90 seconds. The challenge to you is this. Take those 90 seconds, decide the plays you would make with the information that is available, which is admittedly imperfect, and that is deliberate. We don't always have perfect information. Perhaps you didn't keep a card count, or you're not quite sure what's in this deck, or you got distracted for a moment. Whatever your justification is, I refer you to my previous kind of commentary on the art of focusing on what is, which is the state that's in front of you. Then, at the end of that 90 seconds, I'll put a little splash on the screen that says pause. I encourage you at that point to pause this video and type in the comments your line of play in full. Now, of course, you can pause the thing, take as long as you like. You could skip forward and see what I've got to say and adjust the thing. There's so many different ways. This is an honours system. If you want to take part in this exercise, I encourage you to do it in good faith. take the 90 seconds, take the pause, type the line of play. You don't have to do it, just do it in your head if you prefer not to. But it will be relevant, because after that, I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk to you about where I stand on that line of play and the way I see those lines and what I consider to be the optimal choice. And I'm going to explain why. And we'll also reveal any hidden information that is relevant so that you have an idea of where the exercise is going. So, in a moment, this will come up. Do the exercise, don't do the exercise. I think it's a bit of fun. You might not. But please don't worry, especially if you're a newer player watching this, about being wrong. We learn more being wrong often than we do being right. And many times in cards, there isn't really a right and wrong. There's often optimal and suboptimal, but there are also grey areas between those 2 points. There is further towards suboptimal, further towards optimal. We can shift between the two. So I encourage you to just embrace this as what it is. Anyway, gonna let the thing come up on the screen, and we'll go from there. Okay, so we are now back. You've hopefully had fun doing the exercise that I talked about. I'm now going to take a sip of water and talk you through it. What was in front of you was a situation in which you are in a difficult position. You are facing a lethal threat on board. So your HQ has only 3 defense left. Your opponent has 8 defense left. You have a single damaged unit on the board. Your opponent has a single damaged unit on the board. Your opponent has 1 card. You have 3. Your opponent has been ramping. You can tell by their credit count. And this is where we get into the information and how we calculate it. So I said one of the first things I do is look at my opponent's HQ. Brit HQ, and I can see a US bomber. So I know my opponent's main nation and ally. I also know they're on 14 credits. There's a bomber down there, so odds are they're playing Brit-US ramp. Of course, I know my information. I'm playing Germany-Japan, in this case a mid-range deck, and I'm currently on 9 credits. We're late in the game. It's clearly been a very tough battle. We are in a very difficult position. At present, we have a B-25 Mitchell, which, while damaged, presents lethal damage. We have a single Panzer 38T on board, which has only 1 health remaining. So, the next thing is our opponent has 8 HQ defense, we have 3. In hand, we have 20 Panzer Grenadier, an incredibly strong card, a fighter, the MEBF 109, and a Type 94 early tank from Japan, which has come into our hand late. Happens. But what we need to do now is decide what line do we play. So, there are various lines available, but we should prioritize. So your first priority is likely to consider the threat survival. If we do not change the game state, our opponent will win on our next turn. So, how can we change the game state? There is a very obvious change to the game state. We can use the Panzer 38T, push it forward, and attack the Mitchell, which removes the Mitchell from the board. This is almost certainly an optimal play. In fact, I would consider it to be necessary. You could cover with the MEBF. You might consider it, and there is another line there. Cover with the MEBF and use your remaining resources to go aggressive to face. So let's follow that line through. So if we play the MEBF, we have played out a 3-cost card. So we have 6 resources remaining. We drop the Panzer Grenadier. That takes 4 off, so 6 becomes 2. Those 2 resources could allow us to deploy a 35T, which we will gain from Panzer Grenadier, which gives us 2 damage to face, but that seems fairly suboptimal. We could trade it out into the Mitchell. Might be a thing there. Or those remaining credits could allow us to play the 94 early and put combined arms on it, which does take the 94 early up to a 3-3. 3 damage, leaves us in a very strong position with lethal on board. Quite an aggressive line, but you could drop the 94 early, buff it with combined arms, Panzer Grenadier, push it forward, and deal 5 damage, which upgrades to 6 next turn. Sorry, not 6, 3 damage, which then upgrades to 4 next turn. The point being, you can start to threaten lethal. This is another line. So, when we consider these lines, the next thing we should consider is, are there any other factors that are relevant to those lines? Our opponent might be running a countermeasure. Probably not in Brit-US ramp, but it's a possibility. But I'm very quickly discarding it because it's information we don't have. It could be a countermeasure, but odds are they just have an expensive card in hand or a card that they can't use. So the focus becomes remove the threat. In case they do have a countermeasure that can somehow slow us down, it almost certainly benefits us to make the key move first. For me, that key move is to move the 38T forward and attack the Mitchell. The Mitchell is then destroyed. We can then use the remaining 7 credits to do things. So let's assume that we do that. Let's assume that we push the 38T forward, destroy the Mitchell, remove the lethal threat. We now have 7 credits left in hand. Right. Panzer Grenadiers, 4 credits. Then you can get really good value here, right? So Panzer Grenadier onto the board. Deploy the 35T, combined arms it, makes the 35T into a 4-4, run forward, hit face, and you have lethal next turn. So, strong turn, right? 7 credits, super efficiently used. You might have followed that line. In fact, I suspect some of you will have. I suspect I would find that if people have done the exercise in comments, I suspect several people will have followed that line. Unfortunately, those of you who followed that line have now lost the game. Because the next thing we have to consider is, what could our opponent be holding? This is a ramp deck, and our opponent has 14 credits. Our opponent definitely has access to blitz bombers. So, survival is more important than threatening lethal. 100% of the time. You cannot win the game if you lose. Seems obvious, but you'd be surprised how often people miss it. The play is the MEBF 109E. We already have a unit in the front line. Put 3 credits down. That MEBF means that if our opponent has a bomber in hand, it cannot attack our HQ. Now we can choose with our remaining credits. We could drop 4, put the Panzer Grenadier down, and load our hand for next turn, which is what I would do. You could also push forward with the 94 early and hit, and then hope to have the extra advantage next turn. The point remains, you put yourself in a better position. So, time for the secret sauce. What is our opponent holding? Obviously, having designed this exercise, note the answer. Our opponent is holding production order, which was my point earlier. For those of you who chose the aggressive line, who did not cover with the fighter, lose. Why did you lose, and how is this relevant to the conversation we're having? Back to Sun Tzu. Those of you who took the aggressive line lost because you made one less calculation. Just one. You did not account for your opponent's potential play. Not a criticism, you're not a terrible player if you went into that, and if you didn't get it, this doesn't mean you're bad at the game, this doesn't mean it's all over. This is an exercise in learning. The consideration of lines is one that we should be exhaustive in, and this is why I talk about disciplining our mind to remove other considerations. It's why I will encourage Upon Me May, which I will probably come back to at some point. It's why I encourage calm and consideration, taking a moment to breathe and focus so that we can see the lines, remove the pressure, and make the optimal play. Now, of course, there are other factors. What if our opponent draws something that lets them get past the fighter? Some removal, a card that has an effect, anything along those lines with the card that they're drawing at the start of the next turn. Then they do and we lose. But we did not lose playing suboptimally. We lost playing optimally to a random result that we cannot control. If, however, we lose because we chose the aggressive line and didn't cover the bomber, we lose because we made a suboptimal choice. Going further into this, if we don't cover with the fighter and our opponent doesn't have a bomber in hand and has a completely useless card, we win, in all likelihood. But we win playing suboptimally. That is not something that we aim for. I would rather lose playing optimally than win playing suboptimally, and I'm pretty certain Sun Tzu will tell you the same thing, except of course in Sun Tzu's case, we're talking about the creation of a strategy to try and remove the possibility of doing that because lives and empires are at stake. Point is, this is an exercise in focusing the mind. It's an exercise in understanding lines. I don't know if it was useful to you. I don't know if this hits home and you're like, this is great, or whether you're just like, oh, good Lord, this guy's just banging on pointlessly about this overly complex concept, and this is a game, and I don't want to think about it in that depth. And by the way, if that's the way you feel, that's cool. We're all in this differently. These videos, by definition, are aimed at people who want to understand more about game theory and the way it impacts this particular card game. As ever, if it's been useful, let me know. If it hasn't been useful, let me know. Got opinions, go for it. I love it. I hope you've enjoyed it. I will be back with more in future. Until then, stay good humans, and I'll catch you next time.